following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome to Gab with God. I am Reverend Dr. Lori Wiley, the pastor at Litchfield Community Church. Today we're going to look at a story Jesus told that just doesn't seem fair. I've always read it and gotten a little disgruntled because it seems so unfair. But about 3 weeks ago, I was reading it, and it was as though a spotlight shone on it, and it made perfect sense to me. So I'm going to share that with you today, how this parable, that's what Jesus' stories are called, how this parable could make sense. So it comes from Matthew 20. And it's the first 16 verses. I'm going to read them and read them broadly. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers to work in his vineyard. The landowner agreed to pay them a certain amount for the day, a specified amount, and sent them into his vineyard. They arrived at 6 a.m. to start working for the day. 12-hour day. About the third hour, which was 9 o'clock in the morning, the landowner went out, saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing, and told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. This is a very common custom, even in California. We don't have it here in New England, but when we were out there, when my husband needed workers, he would drive down to a parking lot, and there would be a group of people there just waiting to be hired for the day. And so he would check out and see who wanted to come with him, tell them what he needed done, and they would go with him for the day. If he really liked them and they were good workers, he might ask them to come back the next day. But this is something that you would see in some areas even of our country. So he went out at 9 and found people. Then he went out again at about 12 noon. And then again at 3 p.m. and did the same thing. About the 11th hour, which was 5 p.m., the landowner went out and found still others standing around. So asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day, doing nothing?" They answered, "Because no one has hired us." The landowner said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When the evening came, which was 6 p.m., the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones that had been hired at 5 o'clock and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about the 11th hour at 5 o'clock and had only worked 1 hour received the same amount as was promised to the first workers who had been there for 12 hours. So when those who came who were hired first, who had been there for 12 hours, they thought they should get more than the landowner had told them they would get. But each one of them also received exactly what they were promised. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These workers who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. But the owner answered one of them in this way, "Friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for the amount I paid you? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So Jesus ended the story. The last will be first, and the first will be last. What do you think about this parable? How does it make you feel? Does it seem unfair to you? I'm going to give you a riddle. Let's see if you can figure this one out. Let's say we're at Southern New Hampshire Medical Center at 8 a.m. One of the employees has been there since 5 and will be there for 8 hours at minimum wage. Another employee comes in at 7:45 and stays for 45 minutes and earns $50,000. Is that fair? The one who came last and stayed the shortest amount of time earns so much more? What is the answer to this riddle? The one who stays for 8 hours is a nurse's aide who is being paid minimum wage. The one who earns the $50,000 in probably 20 minutes of work is the surgeon. Now that's a riddle. We don't know that that's what happened in this story. In fact, I doubt if it is what happened. It seems that everybody who was working was doing the same job, but we don't know that. We also don't know what mitigating factors there were for being there at the end of the day or the middle of the day or all of that. So let's assume that it was the same work for everybody, and yet they all got the same wage, regardless of how long they worked. Are you a competitive person? Would you be like the early bird workers who worked hard all day? And then would you get angry over the shirkers who showed up late and got the same pay? How do you feel about the one who worked just an hour, receiving the same wage as those who worked 12 hours? We all deal with the temptation to compare ourselves with others and to be jealous if we think someone else got more than they deserved, or we got less than we deserved. It starts early in life. It's called sibling rivalry. I'm going to read you a couple of sentences from this book, Siblings Without Rivalry by Adele Faber and Elaine Maslish. They give us a situation to try to imagine. Imagine that your spouse puts an arm around you and says, "Honey, I love you so much, and you're so wonderful that I've decided to have another wife, just like you. When the new wife finally arrives, you see that she's very young and kind of cute. When the three of you are out together, people say hello to you politely, but exclaim ecstatically over the newcomer. Isn't she adorable? Hello, sweetheart. You are precious. Then they turn to you and ask, how do you like the new wife? The new wife needs clothing. Your husband goes into your closet, takes some of your sweaters and pants, and gives them to her. When you protest, he points out that since you put on a little weight, your clothes are too tight on you, and they'll fit her perfectly. The new wife is maturing rapidly. Every day she seems smarter and more competent. One afternoon, as you're struggling to figure out the directions on the new computer your husband bought you, she bursts into the room and says, "Ooh, can I use it? I know how." When you tell her she can't use it, she runs crying to your husband. Moments later, she returns with him. Her face is tear-stained, and he has his arm around her. He says to you, "What could be the harm in letting her have a turn? Why can't you share?" One day you find your husband and the new wife lying on the bed together. He's tickling her and she's giggling. Suddenly the phone rings and he answers it. Afterwards he tells you that something important has come up and he must leave immediately. He asks you to stay home with the new wife and make sure she's all right. What do you think? Sibling rivalry. We wonder why kids fight and argue. My children would spend more time arguing over whose turn it was to unload the dishwasher than it took to do it. It was all about sibling rivalry, and that's what was happening in this parable. We all deal with these temptations to compare ourselves and to be jealous of someone that we think gets more than we do. There's a story in the Bible about sibling rivalry. There was a parent who had two sons. The younger one knew he wasn't going to inherit the land. The land always goes to the oldest son. And so he said to his father, "Would you give me my portion of the inheritance in money?" And the father did it. He divided his property between them and gave half of the money to the younger son. Not long after that, the younger son decided he wanted to travel. He wanted to go someplace else and get away. So he went to a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent all his money, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. He couldn't even afford to buy food. After he had spent everything, he had nothing left for the basics of life, so he went and hired himself out to someone who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. You know that pigs are fed the garbage. This young man, this younger son, longed to fill his stomach with the garbage that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "What am I doing here? I could at least go home and take care of my father's pigs and be near my family." And so he set out, and he went back home to his father. And he said to his father, he planned this ahead of time, what he was going to say. He had come to his senses, and he was going to say, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. I will be your pig feeder." So after he had put together his little speech, he headed back home. In this story that Jesus told, it says, while this younger son was still a long way off, his father saw him. His father had been watching for him the whole time, and his father was filled with compassion for him. So he didn't wait for his son to come home. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said his little speech, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to the servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the best steaks and let's have a barbecue. Let's have a feast and celebrate, because this son of mine was dead and now he's alive. He was lost and he is found." So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son, the good son, here's where the sibling rivalry comes in, came in from the field where he had been working very hard. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, so he asked somebody, "What's going on?" And they said, "Your brother has come home, and your father has gotten out the best steaks for a barbecue and a celebration, because your brother is now safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he said to his father, "Look, all these years I've been the good son. I've been slaving away, working hard every day in your vineyard on our land. I have never disobeyed your orders, but you never gave me a celebration. So when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. How could this be? Is this fair?" This is sibling rivalry among grown-ups. "My son," the father said, "you are always with me." That's my favorite line. You are always with me. You have a long time relationship with me and my blessing. And everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and now he's alive. He was lost and now he's found. So, who are you in this story? Are you the older son, the good one, who's always done the right thing? Maybe that's me and you. Or are you the younger son, who has wasted a good bit of your life doing really stupid things that were self-destructive, were not good for you, were not good for our world, and yet you have come to your senses and returned to your Heavenly Father? Are you the younger son? That's me. We're both. We're both. And we have to be careful that we don't get into comparing ourselves with others and treating them badly because we think they have been blessed out of turn. As humans, we are always in power struggles, trying to align ourselves with a more powerful group, whether it's in the family through sibling rivalry. And I could ask you, did you raise more than one child? Did you see sibling rivalry? Did you have brothers and sisters? Did you engage in sibling rivalry? And in some ways, it's the worst at your parents' end of life. It does not go away with adulthood, but God's showing us something through this parable that Jesus told. Maybe your power struggle is in the workforce. You see another worker that's being promoted, and you don't think it's fair. Maybe it's politics. You're just sure that your political party is the right one and is not being treated fairly. Maybe it's over the kind of car that you drive. You want to make sure yours is a better vehicle than someone else's, or the kind of clothes we wear. And another category that is coming up so unfortunately in our country is the natural-born citizen versus the immigrant. Seeing ourselves as two separate classes and one superior to the other. It could be even being here in Litchfield. You think, well, I've lived here all my life, intergenerationally, so I should have a superior voice over the newcomers. I grew up here. They don't know as much as I do. They shouldn't have the same benefits that we have. There are many different ways that we set ourselves apart as being in a different group that should receive more than we're getting. And that's one of the things we learn from this parable. What I saw when the spotlight shone on this parable was that there were two kinds of people that were listening to Jesus at the time. There were the Jews and there were the Gentiles. The Jews prided themselves on being the original family of faith in the one true God. They knew they were a superior race. They'd been there the longest. They had a great heritage, a great genealogy, a great history that we still read today. They could brag about their founding father, Abraham, and that they held the depository of the holy documents, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses given to him on Mount Sinai, the tablets of the 10 Commandments. And they also were the cradle, the womb that would bring forth the Messiah to save our world, the Messiah to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And they had certainly borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day for thousands of years. They had worked so hard to follow God's laws, to do things the right way. And it hadn't been easy for them. They had been invaded at least twice, and probably other times. They had been deported, almost the whole of them, deported to Babylon, which is now Iraq, and deported to Persia, which is now Iran, and been in exile. And then you had the Masada, where they had a massacre and were just mowed down by the Romans. So they had been through many suffering experiences. They had borne the heat of the day, and they felt they should be given special status, special favors, and special rewards. That makes sense. On the other hand, the Gentiles were recent converts. They had been pagan. They didn't even know about the one true God until disciples Peter and Paul told them, and other Christians. Their culture was not around the 10 Commandments, far from that. They didn't follow God's laws. Their behavior was heathen. They ate in a disgusting, primitive manner. They had no church manners. They talked during services. They spoke out of turn. Their morality didn't even exist. and they were newcomers to the faith. Therefore, the Jews thought Jews should be the people of privilege, not the new guys who had just gotten there and didn't know what they were talking about. That's how I saw the parable. But the truth is, it reveals some major things about God. One, God owns everything. God owns our world. We do not dictate to God how he will allocate his property. We want to. We think if I were God, I wouldn't let this happen or that happen. But we need to be careful to try to tell God that we're not trying to tell God what to do. This parable teaches us that God has a right to decide how he will allocate his resources. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? He asks. It all belongs to God, and God is in charge of his money. Second, this is something that's wonderful for all of us. God is generous. It says, are you envious of God's generosity? We worship a generous God who lavishes us with blessings. So we want to celebrate God's generosity. God's love and grace are lavished on all of us, whether Jew or Gentile, old or young, natural-born citizen or immigrant. All of those things don't matter. God is generous with all of us. Also, God does not show partiality. This story shows that no one is to demand more for themselves than for others. God's grace is for everyone equally. That's why all the workers got the same pay. The pay was grace. God's generosity is not based on our merit, on our good works. We cannot earn grace, mercy, and favor. We don't earn our salvation or our right to salvation. The danger of the workers who came first, who worked longest and hardest, is that they thought they would be paid based on their merit. Oh, this is what we did, so we should receive more pay. The early birds all labored for definite wages. They thought they needed to do certain things in certain ways for a specified payment, and they never understood correctly about God's gift, pure grace. The first comers made demands because they thought they earned it. The last workers knew they didn't earn it. They recognized the generosity of God. Therefore, we clearly see, if we look into their hearts, that the workers who came last had no defense whatsoever based on their merit. But they enjoyed the goodness of the householder who gave them this wonderful gift of a whole day's pay, even though they had not earned it. The first didn't value the goodness of the householder, but looked at their own merits, and they thought it was theirs by right, and they complained about it. In this parable, human merit means nothing, and God's goodness alone is praised and is decreed as a festive occasion, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. The wages in this parable stand for God's mercy and grace, God's forgiveness, God's compassion, which is given for everyone, not just the chosen few. It's there for you and me today. God loves you. God is compassionate, forgiving, and merciful. And you may be an 11th hour person. If you are, step up, because you can get the full grace of God even today. It's all about God. God is merciful to all. It's all about God's mercy, not who works the hardest or the longest or the best. God's mercy alone should have all the praise. God's goodness and generosity, mercy and grace are more important than our merit, our hours served, our status. So we celebrate what God has to give us. I invite you to be one of those workers, hopefully accepting the grace and mercy of God.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.